but just to kind of give you a few examples, I'll kind of show you how I've kind of seen people do this in the past. For instance, one of my early clients was a young accountant. He was actually my accountant. He actually did the accounting for my company in the first few years that I was in business. And when we were working together on his talk of introduction for a speech he was going to be delivering, he came up with a pretty cool problem statement. He said that he was an accountant and that he helped businesses avoid IRS audits, which is great. That's fantastic. So he would say his name, his company, and say, by the way, I'm an accountant, so I help small businesses avoid IRS audits, because he had to think about he asked himself those questions, what is it that I do for my clients that if I'm not there, or if they don't use me, they're going to have a problem with. So what problem do I solve? And the first few times that I was working with him and I asked him questions, he would say, I do their taxes. Yeah, but why? Why don't they do their own taxes? They're afraid they're going to screw it up. And if they screw it up, what happens? They get audited. Oh, okay, great. Right. So it took us a while to ask the questions, and you may have to do that with yourself to kind of get to the root cause here. But the key thing to keep in mind, though, is that nobody in the audience that Gary, the accountant, was going to be speaking to, nobody in the audience wanted to get audited. So, by the way, when he started with saying, hey, I'm Gary, I'm an accountant, and I help small businesses keep from getting audited, now all of a sudden people are tuning in because they're going, I don't want to get audited, right? And so the interesting thing about him, though, was that when we got to the proof part, it was a little bit more challenging, because as an accountant, it's not like, thousands of clients are going to, Google or to Amazon or something like that and giving them 5-star reviews for being such a great accountant. You're not going to get that Yelp review for the best accountant ever. So he was kind of struggling with his proof. So basically, in order to get to that proof, I just asked him a series of questions. I said, hey, so Gary, how many clients do you have? And he answered, he had about 300 or so. And I said, how many small business tax returns have you processed? And he kind of paused for a second. He said, well, at least a couple of hundred a year for the last 15 years. So I kind of responded back by saying at least 3,000 then. And he kind of nodded. And I said, how many of your 300 clients have been audited since you've been representing them? And this one was a way quicker answer. He kind of looked at me and said, well, none, right? None of them have. And so basically, we just added that as a piece of proof to his talk of introduction, and it worked phenomenally. He said, hey, I'm Gary. I'm an accountant, and I help small businesses avoid IRS audits. For instance, in my career, I've helped clients complete over 3,000 tax returns without a single one being audited. So, I mean, that's a really cool piece of proof that he was able to throw in just by kind of thinking about it a different way. And you can do the same thing with yours as well. So I'll tell you how I adjust my own personal introductions based on what I want the audience to do, by the way. Like for instance, for my proof, I have a number of options just like Gary does. I've had a lot of clients and had some pretty great successes over the years. So in addition to my clients, the clients that I've worked with that have had a lot of success, I've also published a couple of best-selling books about public speaking. So that gives me credibility. I also have hundreds of thousands of people who listen to my podcast every week. So I just pick my evidence based on what I want my audience to do. So like, for instance, if I'm speaking at a convention and I want the audience to come by my booth that I have set up in the trade show at the convention, and I want them to purchase my books, then my introduction might sound something like, hey, I'm Doug Stannard with the Leaders Institute, an international leadership development company, and I help people eliminate public speaking fear. For instance, one of the things I'm most known for is being an author of 2 best-selling books, Fearless Presentations and Mastering Presentations. So basically, by starting out my presentation that way, I'm kind of planting the seed to encourage them to come and buy books from me, right? So if I'm leading a webinar, I'm probably going to use that because there's not a booth and I'm not going to be selling books. Although I could give a link to, Amazon or something like that. But maybe if I'm leading a webinar, though, it's most likely that I want people to purchase a seat in one of my classes. So in that case, I might introduce myself by saying something like, "Hey, I'm Doug Stannard with the Leaders Institute, an international leadership development company, and I help people eliminate public speaking fear." For instance, for the last 20 years, I've taught public speaking classes to over 20,000 people, and I haven't had a single person fail to reduce their nervousness significantly in just a couple of days. So by just starting out with something like that, I'm kind of planting the seed for my credibility on being good at helping people in a classroom format, and that allows me to promote that part. If my goal is to get a bigger audience for my podcast, then I'll start out the speech a little bit differently. I'll say, "Hey, I'm Doug Stannard with the Leaders Institute, which is an international leadership development company, and I help people eliminate public speaking fear." For instance, one of the ways that I do that is with my weekly podcast called Fearless Presentations, which has over 1 million downloads so far. And so by saying that, now all of a sudden people are going, "Wow, he's got that podcast must be pretty good." So now all of a sudden it's planting the seed that, well, if I like the content of this guy, maybe I'll download his podcast. And so if there's 100 people or 1,000 people or 10,000 people in the room, I'm probably going to get quite a few subscribers that way. So the point is that you want to design your introduction in a way that makes people pause and think, "Really? Wow, that sounds pretty good." You want to avoid introductions that make your audience think, "Well, so what, dude?" Right? So it's to make it really, really easy to introduce yourself in a presentation. By the way, I created an online an outline that's on our website that you can just kind of fill in the blanks, and it'll help you kind of create a custom intro for yourself. And I'm linking to that in the show notes. If you just go in the show notes, click the link to the master show notes, and on that, in the middle of the page or so, it's got a little form that you can fill out. It'll create the intro for you. So real quick, before we kind of end the session, though, there are a couple of questions that will sometimes come up that I want to cover related to the introduction, because sometimes folks will just kind of say, "Well, can I just replace my introduction with a PowerPoint slide with my name and stuff like that on it?" And it's okay to make your first slide, or in my case, a lot of times I'll use it as the second slide. The first slide that I use a lot of times is just the title and maybe an image or something, so that people are looking at that as they're coming into the room. But if you can actually make that second slide into an introduction, and sure, a good public speaker will often add an introduction slide with a biography, maybe a portrait, maybe even some contact information if that's important. And I, a lot of times I'll do this myself. However, I never, ever, 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 ever read that slide to my audience. I often I just have it showing up on, behind me as I'm doing my own introduction. I'm still going to do the introduction the way that I'm suggesting you do it, but it kind of helps me build my credibility without me ever having to refer to it. And I'll just kind of click it and go to the next slide when I get to the content. So it's a great way to share more of your work experience or more of your accomplishments without making it sound like you're bragging and that kind of thing. And by the way, in the show notes, if you're looking for a way to kind of use your PowerPoint slides better, I'll put a link to a couple of different episodes that we've done on how to do PowerPoint slideshows a little bit better. I think that the last thing I want to cover, though, and this is really the most important thing, is that, and I mentioned this right at the beginning of the session here, is you want to remember that there is a big difference between a talk of introduction, where you're introducing yourself to people that don't know you, and what we call a presentation starter. And a lot of times people get those two things confused. So when you introduce yourself in a presentation, you just want to use a single sentence or a couple of sentences max, just to build your credibility and tell the audience who you are, just like what we've done here in this episode. And that's only if your audience doesn't know who you are. And this is when you're speaking to a group of people who they have no clue who you are. They have no clue why they should be listening to you. So if you're looking for a presentation starter, though, that's quite different. Your presentation starter should be a brief introduction with relevant details about what you're going to cover in that presentation.